Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
Hello, my name is Joe Nash, Program Coordinator at the Colonie Library, and I'd like to introduce a video to you and tell you about the Big Read Project. About 20 public libraries in Albany and Rensselaer counties are having many events centered around the book Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. These events are sponsored by the National Endowment for the Arts. On May 4th, the kickoff event will be at the Gilliland Public Library when the niece of the author, Zora Neale Hurston, Lucy Ann Hurston, will be there. The Gilliland Library is also having several book discussions of the book. All events of the Big Read can be seen on the Big Read's website. At our library, the Colonie Library, on Thursday, May 17th, Brenda Twiggs, the director of Hudson Valley Community College's library, will be joining us at our noon book review series to give a review of Their Eyes Were Watching God. Now let me introduce you to the video. The National Endowment for the Arts has created an excellent audio discussion of the book, and our Assistant Director, Richard Naylor, has taken this production and added pictures to create a Ken Burns-style documentary. We hope you enjoy it and that you can come to some events about the book. Thank you.
Welcome to The Big Read, a program created by the National Endowment for the Arts. I'm Dana Gioia, chairman of the NEA. The largest reading program in American history, The Big Read is a multifaceted initiative designed to unite communities across the nation through great literature. At a time when reading is declining among all age groups, The Big Read encourages each American to discover the transformative joys of literature. Here's your host for today, the NEA's Director of Literature, David Kippen.
Today we'll discuss the classic 1937 novel, Their Eyes Were Watching God, by Zora Neale Hurston.
Ships at a distance have every man's wish on board. For some, they come in with the tide. For others, they sail forever on the horizon, never out of sight, never landing, until the watcher turns his eyes away in resignation, his dreams mocked to death by time. That is the life of men. Now, women forget all those things they don't want to remember, and remember everything they don't want to forget. The dream is the truth. Then they act and do things accordingly. So the beginning of this was a woman, and she had come back from burying the dead.
Here's somebody who takes the oldest storytelling form, really, that we have, which is the quest romance.
Scholar and professor Carla Kaplan.
In 1937, for a black woman writer not yet that well known, to take the oldest literary form and rewrite the quester as a 16-year-old black girl, this was an absolutely wild thing to do.
This teenage character is Janie Mae Crawford, who leaves her grandmother's plantation shack on an odyssey that will carry her from a loveless arranged marriage with an older man to a second marriage with the founder and mayor of an all-black town, to her final, passionate union with a silver-tongued charmer by the name of Tea Cake. Here's novelist Brett Lopp.
To me, when I first read it, it reminded me of Huck Finn in a way that the main character is on a journey and she moves through one community to another community to another community. So in a lot of ways, I was thinking about Huck Finn and the way he moves down the river toward his reckoning with Jim and slavery and his decisions about that. With Janie, she's moving through basically Florida and ends out in the swamps in the muck. At that time, a novel about a woman achieving selfhood. As a novelist, I look back at that and I say, man, that was really daring. That was very brave.
The people all saw her come because it was sundown. The sun was gone, but he had left his footprints in the sky. It was the time for sitting on porches beside the road. It was the time to hear things and talk. These sitters had been tongueless, earless, eyeless conveniences all day long. Mules and other brutes had occupied their skins. But now the sun and the boss man were gone, so the skins felt powerful and human. They became lords of sounds and lesser things. They passed nations through their mouths. They sat in judgment.
Janie is content.
Novelist Alice Walker.
She is fulfilled as a woman and as a person. She has reached that point where she can say, I've been there. And Janie has managed to have the guts to actually make that journey. And she has come back. And so she is really fine sitting there on her porch with her fan. I so identify with that moment because it is what we all hope. We hope to go and engage the world, on our own terms. And then if we survive, and we might not, but that's the chance we take, then we come back and we're home.
Upon returning home, Janie tells the story of her travels to her friend Phoebe, and through Phoebe, to us. Author Azar Nafisi.
And when her friend goes in to talk to her, she says, let me tell you my story. And you go out and tell them the story. And this is a weapon women have always had. Let me tell you my story. And by telling her story, she takes hold of her life.
Telling the story of Their Eyes Were Watching God may have helped Hurston regain hold of her own life. She wrote it after refusing to marry a man whom she passionately loved, but who wanted her to forsake her career. While hardly an autobiography, the novel does reflect several aspects of Hurston's personal experience. Robert Hemingway wrote the first biography of Hurston.
Well, Hurston grew up in Eatonville, which was an all-black town. She made a point that it wasn't the black backside of a white town. It was an all-black town. And Hurston, I think, took on the security of that environment. Eatonville was a place where people could go down to the general store, Joe Clark's general store, and sit around on nail kegs and benches and, as she put it, pass this world and the next through their mouth. They created, she once said, crayon enlargements of life.
Hurston's speaking voice has the same richness that we find in her writing. In a 1943 interview with Mary Margaret McBride, Hurston discusses the acceptance of her first novel, Jonah's Gourd Vine. Notice how she can't help making a dramatic story out of selling that novel just in time to escape eviction. Then listen to the pure poetry she lavishes on what would otherwise be a simple telegram.
And on November the 16th, the day I was put out the house, I got an acceptance by wire from Lippincott on that day.
That's
How
right.
Nice. And that morning they put me out, and that afternoon I got the acceptance, and Mr. Bert Lippincott, Colonel Bert, he's colonel to me because he's a prince, he telegraphed me that they liked Jonah's Gourd Vine, and they accepted it, and they were offering me $200 advance royalty, and would I accept it? So I dashed to the telegraph office and sent them a wire, terms accepted. I'm singing on my silver singing trumpet.
That silver singing trumpet rarely fell silent. Not only was Hurston a novelist, she wrote plays, essays, an autobiography, and dozens of stories and articles. And after graduating as the only black anthropology student at Barnard College, she made road trips around the American South, collecting folklore by offering prize money for the tallest tale. Robert Hemingway.
And that whole dense texture of African American folklore and the way that black people interact with each other verbally, that was Hurston's world.
Hurston was interested in what she called the Negro farthest down. That's her phrase. And what she was really interested in was depicting black difference. As an anthropologist, as a storyteller, and as a playwright, she wanted to show that black culture was a world unto its own and was actually very, very different than white culture.
Carla Kaplan.
In the 1920s, this was an extremely risky thing to do because the black arts were seen as an important edge against racism, a way of showing sameness. So here comes Hurston with an aesthetic of difference.
Hurston searched out and recorded countless African American folk songs from the South. Here she sings a couple of verses from one song called Mule on the Mount.
This song I'm going to sing is a line and rhythm, and I'm going to call it Mule on the Mount, though you can start with any verse you want and give it a name, and it's the most widely distributed white song in the United States. Well, I heard the first verses I got at my native village of Edenville, Florida. I had me down 2-3 cans of tomatoes. Oh, hand me down 2-3 cans of tomatoes, a can of corn, Lord, Lord, a can of corn. I got a woman, she's pretty but she's too bulldozing. I got a woman, she's pretty but she's too bulldozing. She won't live long, Lord, Lord, she won't live long.
Not only does she have an aesthetic of difference, which makes her very interested in folklore and in looking at other cultures, but she's not writing about middle-class blacks in New York or Chicago or Philadelphia or Boston. She wants to write about blacks in Florida and Alabama.
She takes a black community, because that's what she grew up in, and she helps you to understand and to see the people whose voices that are in the novel.
Once again, Alice Walker.
And so you get to reconnect with uncles and aunts and cousins and people down the road that you wouldn't ordinarily. She captured the language perfectly. It is so amazingly beautiful.
Robert Hemingway traces the beauty of Hurston's language to her upbringing in Eatonville.
Her voice is a folk voice. Her voice comes straight from black people sitting around in the store porch in Joe Clark's store in Eatonville, Florida, telling stories, telling jokes, using language to captivate a listener, using language to get at the profound issues of life.
She was the only Southerner a black Southerner who truly loved her blackness and her Southernness. The other people sometimes felt that it wasn't quite the right thing, that people should really be speaking standard English, and it upset them. Hurston just threw all caution to the winds and said, gee, I like these people. I like the way they sound. And if other people think that we are ignorant and backward because we sound this way, they obviously don't know our history and why we sound this way. And I like the people themselves, so I'm going to present them in their complexity and completeness and fullness and their richness and their contrariness, and that's what you get.
At 5:30, a tall man came into the place. Janie was leaning on the counter making aimless pencil marks on a piece of wrapping paper. She knew she didn't know his name, but he looked familiar. "Good evening, Miss Starks," he said with a sly grin, as if they had a good joke together. She was in favor of the story that was making him laugh before she even heard it. "Good evening," she answered pleasantly. "You got all the advantage 'cause I don't know your name. People wouldn't know me like they would you. You got any smoking tobacco?" She opened the glass case. She handed over the cigarettes and took the money. He broke the pack and thrust one between his full purple lips. "You got a little piece of fire over there, lady?" They both laughed, and she handed him 2 kitchen matches out of a box for that purpose. It was time for him to go, but he didn't. He leaned on the counter with one elbow and cold-cocked her a look. "How about playing you some checkers? You looks hard to beat."
First of all, there's a tremendous power in the language.
Artist Jerry Pinkney illustrated a special edition of Their Eyes Were Watching God.
There is a poetic sense to the language, and certainly a language rooted in the South. And one read, you might think, well, gosh, in so many ways, in the spirit of her writing, that she's actually illustrated the book with words. When Jamie and Tea Cake first meet, and there's an illustration that I created where they're on the front porch of the store, and they are playing checkers. And there's a moment there when you know that there's a spark, and you know that something is going to change for Janie.
"Now, ain't you something, Mr. You never did tell me what your name was." "I sure didn't. Wasn't expecting for it to be needed. The name my mama gimme is Virgil Woods. They calls me Tea Cake for short." "Tea Cake? So you sweet as all that?" She laughed, and he gave her a little cut-eye look to get her meaning. "I may be guilty. You better try me and see."
Her history and her past has been an uphill battle to survive and to find herself and to keep herself intact. And I think we know when we reach that part of the story that her life will begin to blossom.
You're listening to The Big Read from the National Endowment for the Arts. Today, we're discussing Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston.
All through the novel, Hurston identifies blooms and vegetation with Janie's fulfillment. Maybe the most famous metaphor in the whole book comes as the young Janie lounges under a newly flowering pear tree. It's a deeply sensual passage, drenched in voluptuous imagery, perfect for describing Janie's slow awakening into womanhood.
It was a spring afternoon in West Florida. Janie had spent most of the day under a blossoming pear tree in the backyard. She had been spending every minute that she could steal from her chores under that tree for the last 3 days. That was to say, ever since the first tiny bloom had opened. It had called her to come and gaze on a mystery. From barren brown stems to glistening leaf buds, from the leaf buds to snowy virginity of bloom. It stirred her tremendously. How? Why?
So her consciousness begins with a why.
Again, Azar Nafisi.
It is so beautiful because the pear tree becomes a metaphor for who she is and the fact that we remain mysteries to ourselves. And the whole book is a journey from the pear tree and back to the pear tree.
This passage from Chapter 2 is where Janie begins to tell the story of her journey. Carla Kaplan.
Hurston's pear tree passage, which is often read by people, is not only beautifully written, but it's extraordinary in the history of the American novel as one of the most amazing depictions of longing and desire for fulfillment. It's just a beautiful thing.
She was stretched on her back beneath the pear tree, soaking in the alto chant of the visiting bees, the gold of the sun, and the panting breath of the breeze, when the inaudible voice of it all came to her. She saw a dust-bearing bee sink into the sanctum of a bloom. The thousand sister calyxes arched to meet the love embrace, and the ecstatic shiver of the tree from root to tiniest branch, creaming in every blossom and frothing with delight. So this was a marriage. She had been summoned to behold a revelation. Then Janie felt a pain, remorseless, sweet, that left her limp and languid.
The first great flowering in Hurston's career coincided with the Harlem Renaissance, that 1920s golden age of African-American creative expression. At last, black literature, music, art, and politics no longer dealt in apology or defeat, but in assertion and pride. In this creative outpouring, as in so much else, Hurston was the exception. She didn't care a fig whether her work showed black people in a favorable or an unfavorable light. All she wanted was to tell the truth as lyrically as she could, and not everybody would thank her for that. Glorious though the Harlem Renaissance was, it didn't last, and neither did Hurston's popular success. She published Their Eyes Were Watching God in 1937, but within a decade, she was pawning her typewriter just to make ends meet. Though her work became politically unfashionable, she kept on writing. Hurston died in a welfare home on January 28, 1960.
Well, Hurston certainly at the end of her life was in a reduced circumstance, and she had been ill for a good while, and that affected her physical being. But even the people that knew her at that period, and I interviewed a number of people who knew her during the last couple years of her life, her spirit was still irrepressible.
Once again, Robert Hemingway.
She was still the kind of person people loved to be around. She told stories, she challenged people, she laughed. She was a person that even in the midst of difficult circumstances, which she was certainly in at the end of her life, and she was too proud to let other people know that she was in those reduced circumstances, Hurston was still the life of the party.
Her work was still revered and held on to in black communities, but it had fallen completely out of the public eye and out of the national eye.
Carla Kaplan.
So that when she died in 1960, everything was out of print, and in fact, her personal effects were burned in a bonfire behind the house. And if a local black deputy sheriff, at the time a young man named Pat Duvall, hadn't been driving by and realized whose house it was, we would have almost nothing of hers left from that period in her life. He put the fire out and saved quite a bit of material, but we actually almost lost everything. All of her manuscripts, all the papers she had saved, the letters that had been written to her by people like Langston Hughes and Du Bois and Dorothy West and County Cullen, and we almost lost all of that because it was all taken out behind her house and set on fire. By the time she died, she had that much fallen out of the public eye. During her life, she was on everybody's tongue. Everybody knew who Zora Neale Hurston was.
Even death couldn't silence Hurston's ravishing voice. Her writing eventually found a crucial champion in Robert Hemingway. His study of Hurston's life and work coincided with the young Alice Walker's article for Ms. Magazine called In Search of Zora Neale Hurston. Together, Hemingway and Walker sparked a revival of her work, and thanks to them, American literature without Zora Neale Hurston is now unthinkable.
When Robert Hemingway wrote his wonderful biography of Zora, and I read it, loved it, felt really embarrassed as a person of color and as a woman and as a writer that she seemed to have been thrown away. I couldn't believe it. There's something in me that was just so mortified. So I felt that it was really my duty and my pleasure, of course, as duty sometimes is, to go and to try to rectify this.
Robert Hemingway.
Alice went down to Fort Pierce, Florida, and put a gravestone on the spot where people thought probably Zora was buried, but it was really we didn't know for sure because it was a segregated cemetery.
Nobody really knew, and we finally went to the funeral home, and they said, well, we think she's kind of over there in something called the Garden of the Heavenly Rest, and it was this overgrown field. And I went out, searching around, nobody else out there but her, in this fairly big area, and I found this sunken grave. Then I went to try to buy a headstone, and there was a really huge, wonderful one that she would have loved, but I got a smaller one that is okay. It says, Zora Neale Hurston, a genius of the South. In that line, a genius of the South is from Jean Toomer.
Near the climax of Their Eyes Were Watching God, Janie, Tea Cake, and their fellow laborers all huddle in a Florida shack with a hurricane on the way. Novelist Brett Lott.
When the hurricane's bearing down on them, and Tea Cake still doesn't really understand the depth to which Janie loves him, and all the people in the shanties are praying, and their eyes are closed, but their eyes are watching God. Right before that line, which is the title of the book, is where she says how much she loves him. And Tea Cake's worried because she's a woman of class and money, and he's worried that she's not really happy with him. And then she tells him, I love you, basically. And then he puts his head in her lap, and he's so thankful for the fact that she does, in fact, love him for who he is. It's the most moving moment in the book.
Through the screaming wind, they heard things crashing and things hurtling and dashing with unbelievable velocity. And the lake got madder and madder, with only its dikes between them and him. In a little wind lull, Tea Cake touched Janie and said, I reckon you wish now you had have stayed in your big house, away from such as this, don't you? No, people don't die till the time come nohow. Don't care where you're at. We've been together around 2 years. If you can see the light at daybreak, you don't care if you die at dusk. It's so many people never see the light at all. I was fumbling around, and God opened the door. He dropped to the floor and put his head in her lap. Well then, Janie, you meant what you didn't say, 'cause I never knowed you were so satisfied with me like that. I kinda thought. The wind came back with triple fury and put out the light for the last time. They sat in company with others in other shanties, their eyes straining against crude walls and their souls asking if he meant to measure their puny might against his. They seemed to be staring at the dark, but their eyes were watching God.
It is about people first. It's about this relationships that she has and the journey of self first. I think that's what makes a book have staying power.
I had never read a book that showed me my own culture, and it was vivifying. I felt so much more alive. It was as if someone had given me an infusion of some very good organic food like greens or peas or just something that everybody had had for a couple of 100 years, and it kept them strong, and I just loved it.
I got a rainbow wrapped and tied around my shoulder. I got a rainbow wrapped and tied around my shoulder. It looked like rain. Lord, Lord, it looked like rain.
Thanks for joining The Big Read. This program was created by the National Endowment for the Arts. It was written and produced by Dan Stone. Readings from Their Eyes Were Watching God were by Ruby D., used with permission of Harper Audio. Original music for the program by Clint Hoover, Pat Donahue, and Philip Brunel. Special thanks to Katie Davis, Sarah Spitz, Molly Murphy, and Erica Koss. David Kippen was our host. I'm Dana Gioia.
Terms accepted. I'm singing on my silver singing trumpet.
Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.